Thank you, Cornelia, for that kind introduction. So I want to start out by addressing the younger people in the room, which is the majority of you, younger than me. And what I want to say to you is slightly stark, is this, that your leaders have failed you, your governments have failed you, your parents and their generation have failed you, your teachers have failed you, and I failed you. And what I mean by that is that we have all failed to warn adequately and to prevent the dangerous climate change that is now here and that is coming and that is definitely going to get a lot worse. Definitely. And because of that failure, I'm afraid for you. I have fear for you. I fear that some of you are unlikely to grow old. And there is nothing really worse for human beings than not being able to take adequate care of the next generation. I'm really sorry to have to be the one to say this to you, though I suspect that many of you already know that something like this is true, and I'll come back to that point. So why do I say this? Why do I come with such a negative message? Well, let's talk about the Paris Agreement, because that's what is supposed to be giving us all hope around dangerous climate change, yeah? And it was a remarkable achievement. It was hard to expect anything better than Paris. Every country in the world had to agree, and incredibly, they did. And they came up with reasonably bold proposals for reining in climate dangerous emissions. So let's talk about why that extraordinary achievement, very hard to see how one could have hoped for more than Paris, was absolutely not enough. So the first thing to say about Paris is that, of course, Paris was now a few years ago, and things have got quite a bit worse since then. The world's weather systems appear to be spinning out of control, just in the last 3 years, basically, since around the time of Paris. And we could talk about that in detail if you want to. Other bad things that have happened since then, well, the most recent was, you may have heard that there is new scientific evidence about the extent to which heat has been stored in the oceans, a lot more than was previously recognized. And that's a kind of ticking time bomb part of the global overheating problem, which is not going to go away. So things have got worse since Paris, and meanwhile, the initial signs of compliance with Paris are not good. I'll come back to that point. Next problem with Paris, of course, is that, as we all know, the most powerful man in the world, from what is in practice really still the most polluting nation in the world, the United States. They say that China is, but of course that's false, really. It only looks like China is because you ascribe all the emissions to China for all the products that China exports to us and to the Americans and so on. The most powerful man in the world, the most powerful country in the world, has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which is a pretty devastating hammer blow against Paris. But it's much worse than that. If we talk about the 2-degree target for Paris, I'll come to 1.5 degrees a bit later in my talk. 1.5 degrees is unbelievably optimistic to think that we could possibly manage that. I'll come back to that. If we talk about the 2-degree target in Paris, well, most scientists agree that actually, if all of the commitments that are supposed to be made in order for the Paris Treaty to work were made, the actual dangerous climate change that would result would raise global temperatures by quite a lot more than 2 degrees. It would probably be 2.7, 3, 3.4, something like that. In other words, the science on which the Paris Agreement is based is itself overly conservative, overly optimistic. And that's not too surprising when you consider that the IPCC is actually not a properly scientific process. It's a scientific process that has built into it also a political process. But it's worse than that, because actually the commitments that countries have made towards those Paris targets are well short of what would be required in order to meet those targets. Right? Countries voluntarily commit under Paris to say what are they going to do to meet their Paris obligations. And if you add all those up, and people have added them all up, they come to considerably less than what Paris requires in order to work. But it's worse than that. You see there's a pattern emerging here. Because actually, the commitments that countries have made, the commitments that governments have made to reach those Paris targets are actually in stark contradiction to what virtually every single one of those governments, with possibly the exception of Bhutan, are planning to do over the next 10 years or so. So virtually every country in the world has plans to encourage further economic growth, has plans to encourage the building of, or simply to build, a lot more infrastructure, transport infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, etc. Most of those plans, not all, but most of those plans stand in opposition to the possibility of achieving those Paris commitments. And will you tell me which one is likely to win out, right? Classic dilemma. If you have the business ministry against the environment ministry, or the chancellor against the climate change minister, well, which one wins? I'll leave it to you to guess. But it's worse than that, because the IPCC, the worst thing arguably about the IPCC process is that it seriously underestimates the possibility of feedbacks which could spiral the climate system out of control, and which may already be kicking in, potentially explaining the disastrous weather chaos of the last few years. Among those feedbacks are the albedo loss feedback. So that's the loss of ice, for instance, in the Arctic. And the less ice you have, the less heat and light gets reflected, the more gets absorbed. And there are scientists who suspect that the albedo loss situation is a lot worse than the IPCC have taken into account. And most scarily of all is the situation vis-a-vis methane, which we know now is starting to be released in significant quantities, again, mostly from the Arctic, from the permafrost, etc. And, well, they call it the methane dragon, those who are in the know about this. And they call it the methane dragon for a reason. I mean, dragons are a sort of icon of something kind of terrifying, overwhelming, out of control. If that methane release starts to accelerate, which might already be happening, and may well happen in a big way over the next 5, 10, 15 years, well, that locks us into catastrophic climate change, probably runaway climate change, because you then start getting a further vicious circle of more ice being melted, more methane being released, etc. And the crucial thing to remember about methane is that methane is a greenhouse gas approximately 25 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. And the final thing to know about the Paris Agreement is that the Paris Agreement, for its targets later this century to be achieved, depends on climate engineering technologies, geoengineering technologies, the idea being that you can engineer the climate of the entire Earth. There are only two problems with this dependence of the Paris Agreement on those technologies. They are firstly that the technologies do not exist. And I mean that pretty much literally. Most of them are simply fantasies that scientists, technologists, and engineers have. The ones that do exist have not been tried at scale, and we don't know that they'll work at scale if they were tried at scale. And the second problem is that even if they do exist or did exist, it would in most cases be profoundly reckless, radically unprecautious, to put them into action, to bring them in at scale. It would be an experiment with the entire globe, with enormous deleterious possible and actual side effects. The one which they talk about the most, BECCS, which is basically growing lots of biomass that you then burn, you allegedly sequester the carbon, you allegedly keep the carbon safe for hundreds of years under the surface of the Earth. If that process works, which there's serious reason to doubt that you can do all of those things at scale, if you did it at scale, it would be devastating to the Earth's ecosystems. You would be basically creating huge amounts of monoculture and replacing the biodiverse ecosystems which need restoring rather than replacing. So, geoengineering is built into virtually all the Paris scenarios. We've got no reason to believe it works, and if it does work, it probably still shouldn't be used. And I'll come back to exactly why it shouldn't be used in a bit more detail later in my talk. The conclusion, it seems to me, one is bound to draw from this, and look, I would love to be wrong, so please correct me if I can be corrected in the question and answer session on this point. But I've given this talk a number of times and I haven't heard any corrections yet. The conclusion I think one has to draw from this is that, well, to put it in a slightly crude, sort of modern way, Paris is toast. We know, if we're prepared to actually look at the facts, that the aims of the Paris Agreement will not be achieved, and they'll almost certainly be missed by a long way. That means that dangerous climate change is coming, and it is going to get a lot worse for a long time to come. And, well, that's a key part of the context in which I say that we failed you, and that we failed. It seems to me there's only one possibility, and I'll come back to this in a second, there's only one possibility for how what I've just said could prove to be wrong, which is if people came to realize the kind of points that I've just been making and that a few others are starting to make, and came to realize just how desperate the situation was, then they might decide to do something completely unprecedented to change it. But it would have to be completely unprecedented. You get a sense of the scale of what I'm talking about. We're talking about turning around the entire supertanker of the world's economy, the entire supertanker of the world's civilization. It seems to me, in fact, and I'll turn to the visualizer now, please, that there are three possibilities before us in this context. So, possibility number one is that we do what I just described. We transform civilization, a transformed civilization. We absolutely radically alter the entire basis of pretty much everything that we do. The kind of transformation we're talking about is a lot bigger than, for example, just a large-scale conversion to renewable energy. We would also have to be talking about radically reducing the amount of transportation of goods and people around the world, radically relocalizing, radically changing our farming practices, the entire nature of our agriculture, radically reducing the amount, obviously, of meat that we eat in countries like this, etc. It would be a total transformation, the likes of which we have never known, certainly not since history began. Well, look, I hope that happens, and probably like many of you, I'm working to make it happen. But what I want to put to you this evening, among other things, is the thought that it would be a bold person who was prepared to commit to the thought that that is going to happen, that we're going to make it happen, that we're going to make it happen quickly enough. It would be a very risky bet to bet everything upon that kind of completely unprecedented transformation and overcoming all the vast vested interests and ignorances and stupidities and so on and so forth which stand in the way of it. So that is why I think we have to consider further possibilities. So, possibility number 2, a successor civilization after some kind of collapse. And that, it seems to me now, is what we have to start to think is very likely to happen, or put it this way, actually, very likely to be the best scenario we can realistically hope for or plan towards. If the sketch that I gave you about Paris is right, then we are facing a burden almost certainly, unless we are incredibly lucky or incredibly determined and brilliant, we are facing almost certainly changes around the world which are going to bring an end to this civilization with extreme prejudice. And so we need to think about what comes after it, considering the possibility seriously that that is what will happen, that this civilization will collapse. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. The third possibility, of course, is simply total collapse. And in a way, there's not much that needs to be said about that. It's obviously highly, highly undesirable. I'll just say a tiny bit about it. There are various different forms that it could take. When I talk about total collapse, that could mean simply there is no more civilization, but there are a few people hanging on here and there. Lovelock talks about a few thousand breeding pairs in the Antarctic. Or it could be worse than that. It could mean complete human extinction and extinction of most other mammalian life on Earth. Or it could be worse than that. It could be the elimination of virtually all complex life. Why could it be as bad as that? Because if something like the methane dragon really does start to fly and causes a runaway effect, there is no knowing how much it will go on. There isn't very good or reliable science on this, but some scientists think that it could push up global temperatures by something like 12 degrees. It might not stop at all. James Hansen talks about the possibility of the same kind of thing happening on Earth as happened on Venus. You may be aware that Venus's atmosphere is made up quite largely of carbon dioxide from extreme greenhouse effect. That's why Venus is a lot hotter than Mercury, even though Venus is a lot further from the sun than Mercury. The extreme possibility, and it is possible, is that the oceans would start to boil off on Earth, and that would be the end of all complex life, possibly even of all life. Now, I'm not going to talk much more about that. I think it's obvious that total collapse has to be avoided, and it doesn't hugely matter when you drill down within it which version of it you have, although it still does matter a bit. I'm more interested in talking about this, a successor civilization after collapse. Because it seems to me that what we've actually done, mostly up to this point, is assume that we can transform our civilization, or actually, more properly, what we've mostly done is assume that we can just kind of tinker with it and reform it, and that will be enough. The most we've tended to assume is that we need a civilizational transformation. I'm suggesting that's the least that we need to aim at, but that it's not enough to just aim at it. We have to take seriously the possibility that given how bad things are, given how much we've let them go, that this is now going to be very hard to attain. And that something like this may be the best we can hope for. Any which way you look at these three possibilities, they justify my title, the title of my talk. This civilization is finished. Because the best outcome that could happen is that we transform this civilization out of all recognition. It will not look the same at all. It will be a transformation more radical than the change between the era of the 16th, 17th century and the Industrial Revolution. It will be more radical even than the Agricultural Revolution, I would suggest. It will be a total transformation. This civilization, business as we know it, is finished. It has a sell-by date on it. We just don't know how far past that sell-by date we're going to be able to keep the balls in the air. This civilization is finished. The question now is what comes after it. Is it going to be a transformed civilization? Is it going to be some kind of successor civilization? Or is it going to be nothing at all? Okay, so what is to be done? The second half of my title. If I'm right, what is to be done? And I've got a series of ideas on that I want to share with you. Another list. Number one, wake up. We need to wake up. We need to wake up to this reality. The think tank that I chair, that Cornelia kindly referred to, is called Greenhouse, and our previous project was called the Post-Growth Project, talking about why we had to give up the fetish for growth. Our new project is called the Facing Up to Climate Reality Project. And it does, I hope, what it says on the tin. What we think is that people need to face up to these very harsh realities that I'm sketching for you here, and not pretend any longer that we can get away with just focusing on, say, changing our energy infrastructure to renewable energy, or even get away with assuming that we can and will succeed in transforming our civilization in the way that I very much hope we still might. This waking up process is not necessarily particularly pleasant or easy. It may involve you, for example, if you're willing to go through it, experiencing some despair. It certainly should involve you experiencing some fear and some, well, a lot of sadness. If you're not sad about what's happening, if you're not afraid in the context of the kind of thing I'm saying, then you're not paying attention. And in fact, we can go further than that, I think. There's a wonderful new branch of psychology called eco-psychology. And what the eco-psychologists argue is that the despair, the fear, the sadness, the rage that we feel in this kind of context is rational and could even be described as a kind of consciousness arising from the earth itself, in the sense that we are feeling what we are doing to our beautiful planetary home. And those kind of feelings are appropriate. If you're not, as I say, if you're not feeling some of those feelings, if you're not feeling some of them right now, well, then one suspects there might be something wrong with you. So what the eco-psychologists say is, don't as conventional psychology does, focus on the individual and say, well, this individual is feeling sad, they need to be fixed, right? Look at that individual and say, this individual is feeling sad. Oh, that tells us something reliable. That is an expression of something reliable in relation to what's actually happening at this point in history and what's happening to the earth. So if you're experiencing bad feelings around this, well, then you're not alone, and you may be more rational than the people who are not experiencing those bad feelings. I'll also just briefly mention in passing that if you're experiencing them in a really, really bad way, well, then you should actively seek support from someone who can actually give it. For example, an eco-psychologist, or come and talk to me and I can potentially put you in touch with the growing number of therapists and psychiatrists who are actually seriously interested in helping people who are suffering from what we're doing to the earth and from the likely consequences in our lifetimes of that. I'm just going to mention one person who's also very worth reading in this connection, who is the deep ecologist Joanna Macy. For example, her book, The Work That Reconnects. And that book is sort of like a guide for the person who is involved in this kind of difficult journey. She used to call the work that she does along these lines despair work, which I think is quite a useful phrase for it. So, firstly, let's wake up. Let's wake everyone else up too. It's not just us in this room. Secondly, we need to talk about this, and that's why it's really important that in about another 10 minutes or so, I'm going to stop and we're going to have a question and answer. It's really unhealthy to keep all this in the confines of your own mind. Let me tell you a very quick story about how the Greenhouse Facing Up to Climate Reality project started. We decided we needed to have a conversation among ourselves in the core team at Greenhouse of what was happening in relation to climate, was it enough, etc. And we started off with go-round. And what we had to say in the go-round was, what do you think is going to happen and what are your feelings about it? If I remember rightly, I was the first person to go, and I said something like, well, what I think is going to happen is that very probably there is going to be a collapse. And what are my feelings about it? I'm terrified for myself, let alone for people who are younger than me. And I feel very lonely in it. I feel very alone in it, because I think that no one else is really thinking this. And the next person went, and they said pretty much the same. And then the next person said pretty much the same. And of course, what was interesting about that was that by the time we'd gone around, two things had emerged. Firstly, that the feeling that some of us had, certainly that I'd had, that maybe I could sort of hold on to some hope that maybe I was wrong because maybe it was only me who was thinking this. Well, that was gone, right? No, it turned out that everyone else had been secretly thinking it as well. But then the second thing was more encouraging and more liberating, which was, so actually we can talk about it. It's not just me. We can talk about it in a group, and perhaps if we're having this conversation, starting to realize that we've all really got this fear, perhaps there's lots of other people out there who have it too, which is why I decided to start giving these kind of talks. Thirdly, we need to think about my option number 2, the successor civilization idea. We need to think civilizational succession. We need to think about what that actually means, because what it means is very, very challenging. We need to think, for example, about how, if there's going to be some kind of partial collapse at least, we preserve the values of civilization through that. Very, very difficult. A role, it seems to me, here for writers, for academics of all kinds, certainly for philosophers like myself. I think very little of this work has been done seriously yet, but I think this kind of building of a new kind of imaginary, which can cope with the kind of scenarios I'm talking about, well, it's hard to think of intellectual work that could be more important at this time. Fourthly, following on from that point, we need, as I describe it, to build lifeboats through the storms that are coming. What kind of things do I mean by that? Well, I mean a whole load of things, and I can only sketch a few examples of them here. So we could start out with a little bit of individual prepping, preparing for potential collapse. So I would recommend to you, for example, to not keep all your money in the bank, but to keep some under your mattress, because it may well be that the banking system, the financial system, is not with us for very much longer. I'd recommend you to store some food, as I'm doing. By the way, I have got the money, but it's not, for anyone watching online, it's not actually under my mattress, so don't go looking there. You'd have to like tear up the whole house to find it. You still might not. We have to build community. The relations we have with each other, which have been very fragmented by the kind of society that we live in, an individualistic, neoliberal, etc. society, those relations are going to be absolutely vital if there is some kind of partial collapse, as I'm suggesting there is very, very likely to be. The transition town movement is a good model here and has already achieved a certain amount. That needs to be built on, expanded. We need to work on how to preserve things which will be useful to future people through a potential collapse. For example, seed banks. Seed banks is a great example. Quite challenging, though, in the context of climatic change. The great seed bank at Svalbard, and if many of you heard this worrying story, was seriously disturbed recently by the massive increase of temperatures in the Arctic. It was thought to be pretty much invulnerable. It's a seed bank basically in the ice, but it started melting. We have to think about how to preserve seeds through climatic change, and we also have to think about the kind of seeds which are going to be useful, basically being geographically distributed from where they originated, right, in relation to temperature rise and therefore changes of ranges of plants. So we should be, for example, in this country, planting native species, of course, but we should also be planting some non-native species which will cope with higher temperatures, which are very likely to be coming our way. In Greenhouse, we call this kind of work, under my item 4 here, we call it transformational adaptation. We need to adapt to the climate change that is coming, and it needs to be, in ambition, it needs to be transformational. It needs to be mitigatory at the same time as it's adaptive, and it needs to be taking into account the serious changes that are likely to be coming. There's another phrase which has started to be used in this connection, which I think is also very useful. People are talking about deep adaptation. And deep adaptation means adaptation which is actually specifically premised on the thought that collapse is likely. Deep adaptation considers the thought, what if we fail? What if we really do fail and things start to collapse? We need to be, for example, preparing for sea level rise and not doing completely absurd things, such as building nuclear power stations by the seaside, which is where virtually all nuclear power stations are and are built. I mean, an absolute definition of insanity at this moment in history, to build these things which are toxic for hundreds of years, highly toxic for hundreds of years, in places where they're vulnerable to something which we know is extremely likely to be coming. And if civilization does partially even collapse, how confident are you that all the kind of resources that are needed to keep those nuclear power plants safe are going to remain intact? We've already seen at Fukushima a little bit of what can happen even in the middle of an intact civilization. when something hits a nuclear power station. Remember that there are going to definitely be more natural disasters. Of course, we can't really use that word natural disasters anymore because they're partly man-made, most of them now. There are definitely going to be more natural disasters. There are definitely going to be climate disasters coming in the next generation. There's a slight chance that we might be able to transform to stop climate catastrophe, but there will definitely be more climate disasters, as we're seeing right now. Building nuclear power stations in the context of that, it is absolutely absurd. The deep adaptation agenda also is another reason for thinking that there's something very wrong about the ambition of geoengineering. Because to geoengineer, to have this incredibly hubristic idea of we're going to control, humanity is going to control the climate of the whole Earth, you have to have a technological infrastructure which you are confident you can support for the long run, right? So imagine, for example, we put a load of mirrors in space, which is what some of the fantasists want to do, to deflect away sunlight so that we can beat some of the effects of global overheating. We have to be able to be confident that those mirrors will be able to stay up there for a very, very long time. And in fact, actually, many of the proposals for mirrors in space are not literally mirrors. There are lots of very, very small particles that you put up there, and then they start to fall down again, and then you put more up there. Well, what would happen if you had a project like that, and then suddenly you weren't able to put them up there anymore because the country that was supposed to do that has collapsed? Then you could get a sudden spiking in temperature, which is far worse than a gradual increase in temperature. Or think of some of the other potential side effects from geoengineering. People want to seed the oceans with iron and other stuff to create plankton blooms that will then sink to the bottom and can be sequestered and that kind of thing. We don't know what the effects of that are going to be. If we are on top of our game, maybe we can monitor those and then do interventions to counter the horrible negative side effects quite like to happen from an intervention like that. But we can't do any of that if the civilization in question has collapsed. And you might then get some kind of vast oceanic dead zone opening up and nothing human beings can do about it. One of the morals here is that there are worse things that could happen than civilizational collapse. And I think as humans we're quite bad at thinking that thought. But what could be worse than our civilization collapsing? Well, here's something that could be worse. If our civilization collapses in a really horrific, uncontrolled way and poisons the remaining ecosystems at the same time, right? So be very careful what you wish for. The deep adaptation agenda says we need to be thinking and acting now in ways that take seriously into account the possibility that we will not be able to do the kinds of interventions in future that we can do now. Fifth, holding actions. This is a term from Joanna Macy. What does she mean by this? She means actions to hold the damage at bay and slow it down, buy ourselves more time. What kind of things come under this heading? Well, again, a wide variety of things. Everything from consumer boycotts to divestment campaigns. Obviously, Cambridge University must divest from fossil fuels, to political action, lobbying, getting involved in electoral politics. Don't make the mistake of thinking that because I'm saying that civilizational collapse in some form or another is likely to happen, that we should give up on these conventional methods. Not at all. They're still absolutely vital right now. It's just that they're not enough by themselves anymore. We should think of them primarily as holding actions, as holding back the potential catastrophe, rather than actually either being able to stop it completely or being able to genuinely ameliorate its consequences. I would also throw in here, obviously, given my perspective, that I would urge you all to not just vote Green, but to join the Green Party. It's great if you're in Labour or if you're a supporter of Julian Huppert or whatever, and you're trying to do the right thing in those contexts. But there is only one party which is even remotely serious about the kind of agenda that we're talking about here this evening. The agenda which will determine our futures, even though the popular press most of the time is preoccupied with Brexit and Strictly Come Dancing and what have you, i.e. the climate crisis. And that is the Green Party. So holding actions are a vital part of what we need to do. Sixth point, holding actions are not enough. We should rebel. That's why I've distributed these Extinction Rebellion leaflets around the room. These guys, who I've just joined with recently, very, very impressive. They're saying, look, this is an emergency. It is incredibly urgent. It is going to determine our futures. The governments have completely failed us. We should not any longer accept their authority. It's not enough to do consumer boycotts and vote and so on. We should do nonviolent direct action as well. And I think they're exactly right. The next big Extinction Rebellion action is on the 17th of November in London. I was there at the launch. You can watch that on the Extinction Rebellion website. It was an inspiring event. The event on the 17th will, I think, be quite a lot bigger. And, well, if you're impressed by anything that I'm saying this evening, I would urge any of you to seriously consider going down there and taking part in that, and more generally joining in with what the Extinction Rebellion are doing. I think this is an idea whose time has very much come. I'm reminded a little bit of the marvelous film series that some of you will be familiar with, the Hunger Games trilogy. The second of those films was called Catching Fire, and the idea there was that some small gestures of disobedience and defiance can create a spark that catches light and can ignite a much, much larger rebellion. Now, I'm not talking about us doing the kind of things that people did in the Hunger Games films. Thankfully, our scenario is not quite as horrific as the scenario those fictional characters were living under. But the potential future that we're facing is pretty much as horrific as theirs. And so it seems to me that the least we can do is rebel through nonviolent direct action, as the Extinction Rebellion marvelously are doing. One little side note on that. People sometimes say to me, oh, Rupert, you talk too much in terms that are kind of fearful, and you make people sad and scared, and you don't give them enough hope. And my reply is, well, I don't think that this is really a time where hope is the most appropriate emotion to feel. What we need right now is courage. What we need right now is courage to face the reality and to try to do the right thing in the face of it. And that is what the Extinction Rebellion people are showing. They're showing a real courage, a willingness to put their bodies on the line, etc. And if enough of us manage to do that, we could change the course of history. And we could bring about, conceivably, this transformed civilization, which I mentioned earlier, and which, of course, must be a much more hopeful idea than the successor civilization after collapse. Do I think it's likely to succeed, the Extinction Rebellion? No. Do I think it might succeed? Yes. And that's the wonderful thing about human action in the future. One can never know what's going to work and what isn't. I wouldn't bet on it succeeding, but I would like to throw myself into trying to make it succeed. And the more of us who are brave enough to do that, the more chance that it might just succeed. And even if it doesn't succeed, it will at least have shown some courage and some willingness to look what's coming in the face. And that brings me to the seventh and final thing on my list. We need to stop. What do I mean by that? So I'm encouraging you to do all these things, join the Green Party, rebel, wake up, talk about this and so on. But there's something else as well. We need to stop. We need to slow right down and actually give ourselves a chance to really take all of this in and really think about it and really feel it. If we don't do that, then we won't wake up properly and we won't be in a good position to wake everyone else up. We need to stop and give ourselves time to talk about this and work through issues in relation to it. And only if we stop will we actually be in a good position to do the dramatic, courageous things that we're going to need to do under these headings if there is to be hope emerging from all of this. Paul Kingsnorth, who saw a lot of the way things were going some years ago and was one of the founders of the Dark Mountain group, said the following. He said, "There is an abyss opening up before us. We need to be brave enough to look into it. And only if we do that will we then know what to do next." And that's what I mean by stopping. So I urge you to do these various things. Use your abilities, use your intelligence and your potential in the way that best fits you to them. I would say don't restrict yourself to just one of them, though, that we need to be giving ourselves multiple options. We've gambled too much to date on being able to stop the juggernaut from destroying us. We need to think very seriously about what will happen if we fail, and that's why these are important. But the first thing I want to suggest to you that we need to do is to stop. Give ourselves a chance to reflect on all of this. And only if we do that will we be actually well placed to make the next moves forward. And now I'm going to stop. I'm going to throw it open to you for questions and discussion, which means that we're going to start to talk about this, which I think is deeply necessary. Thank you so much for coming here, and thank you for your attention.
That was a really awesome talk, threw up so much material for debate. I'm just going to ask one question before we get started on the Q&A, so if everyone else starts thinking of their questions as well. I just wanted to ask Rupert whether you could expand a bit more on what you meant by the term civilization collapse and how you actually envisage that playing out. Obviously, I appreciate that there are probably going to be multiple ways that that could happen, but whether you could elucidate a bit more on what that would exactly mean.
Yeah, so obviously that's a huge question, but a very important one. Will it be fast? Will it be slow? We don't know. It could be either. Do we have any signs of what it looks like already visible to us in the world? Well, I'm afraid that we do. I think you could argue that there are some morbid symptoms in this country and certainly in the United States that point to a kind of the beginnings of a kind of societal disintegration. Much more to the point, look at what's happening in places like the Congo or the Yemen. And bear in mind that, of course, one of the reasons why the conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa and parts of Africa have been as severe as they have been in the last few years is already climate change. And that's only going to get worse. The projections for Africa are frankly, incredibly sad and scary. It's very, very hard to see a good future coming for Africa and the Middle East. I think we see some of the early signs of what collapse could look like, for example, right now in Yemen. But, there really isn't, it would be great for people to do some imaginative work and empirical work around this. There's very little at the moment. There are also limits as to the extent to which it can be done. And I don't think we should try to do too much modeling of it or too much worrying about it. I think the more important things that we need to do are firstly, obviously, to try to prevent it from happening. And secondly, to act in ways that we could have some reasonable basis for thinking will be helpful to us in the context of any kind of collapse. So what are some of the basic things that one needs? And, we go back to very basic points here, like food and water, right? And in that context, I want to make a controversial remark. Nothing I've said so far should be too controversial, but because it really isn't mostly. It's just being willing to no longer be an ostrich. But the controversial remark is this: that I imagine this being Cambridge, that the great majority of you in the room are in favor of freedom of movement. And I do think that is a shibboleth that needs to be re-examined in the context of what I'm talking about here. So consider, for example, the fact, which I think is a fact that should disturb us in the context which I've been describing, that this country cannot feed itself. We're way, way short of being able to feed ourselves. We depend upon other countries being able to buy food from other countries. So we don't have food sovereignty, and I would argue we don't have food security in the kind of world that we're moving into. And if you think something like, what we should try to do is create a world where we can gradually kind of move ourselves a bit closer to being able to feed ourselves by doing things like changing our diets, eating a lot less meat in this country, and so on. And nevertheless continue to have kind of interdependence with other countries such that we can call upon them to give us some of the food that we need. Well, if you start getting kind of mega famines occurring, say in Africa or the Middle East. Does that situation continue to be viable? You know? I mean, both in practical terms, but also in moral terms. Right? What sense does it make to think that we could continue to justify morally importing food from other countries when millions and millions of people in other countries are starving? So it seems to me we have to start to take more seriously, as a real priority, being able to feed ourselves in this country. And the more you carry on increasing the population of this country, the more impossible that becomes as a goal. So there's my one controversial remark for the evening. If what I've said is right, then it may mean that we have to start to rethink our commitment, which I'm sure many of us have on an instinctive basis, to freedom of movement.
Thank you. So Shruti and Steve-O, our lovely mic runners, do you want to come down and grab the mics? So does anyone have any questions for Rupert? Please don't be shy, put your hand up if you have any questions. Yeah, there's a question there. The mic is on, Shruti, if you just...
I was wondering how you recommend going about talking to people about this, because I've been trying to talk to my family and friends about this for the past few weeks, and I think they're ready to get me sectioned.
Yeah. Okay, so I've tried to model some of it. So one thing which I think is quite important is creating some kind of emotional resonance. And that's one of the reasons why I always say something like, I'm afraid for you. And that brings something real into the room, which is not there in most talks around this. When climate scientists talk about this, they hardly ever say anything like that. They feel it's kind of not their role, it's kind of too touchy-feely or something. Right? It's not their expertise. So that's one quite important point I would make. You've got to try to establish some kind of emotional resonance. You've got to also provide an opportunity for discussion. It's really dangerous on this one to do what happens, for example, at some academic conferences where you have someone give a long lecture and then there's like 5 minutes for questions or something. No. There's got to be a possibility for actually thinking about it and feeling about it kind of together for a while. I think it's also useful to help people to understand that they're not alone. In the way I described. So let me actually ask for a little show of hands at this point. Can I ask you, please put your hand up if you've heard someone give a talk or read a paper or something which has been quite as, well, I would use the term climate realist. Others would use the term pessimistic or negative or something. Put your hands up if you've ever heard a talk or read a paper which is as climate realist as this one before. Okay, so a reasonable number of you. And now let me ask you to put your hands up if you've ever kind of thought the kinds of thoughts that are in this talk before. If you've ever thought something like, it seems to me that probably we're going to collapse. Okay, and that's what I thought would happen. At least twice as many people put their hands up. And that tells me, and I hope tells you, that what I'm saying is right, that we've been refusing to talk about this. We've been kind of keeping it a secret and worrying about it by ourselves. And I think that attitude is no longer sustainable, literally. And we need to share it. So to do things like that and to enable people to understand that they're not alone in these fears, I think that's really, really important. I think it's really, really harmful if people are thinking, is it just me? Am I going crazy?
Yeah, we got another question over there.
Thank you. Thanks, Rupert. I don't know if I am thanking you, actually. It was terrifying. All I would say is, I think what you said was brilliant, and I think for most of us, though, there's a strange cognitive dissonance, because the way you're talking feels both realistic and utterly incomprehensible simultaneously, in terms of the sort of lives that we're all leading. And one of the things that I sort of worry about is that you talk about civilization collapsing as if it was one thing. It seems to me that civilization, as you say, if it is one thing, is in serious trouble right now. But the point is that there are a lot of people who are trying to create the impression that there is a version of civilization that will, if you like, ride out all of the changes that you're talking about. And that will be very differentially experienced. And some people might be sitting in this hall in 100 years' time, you know, if you like, in that lifeboat of the luxury and the sort of relative level of privilege of this society, whilst civilization has completely disappeared elsewhere. So that's where I guess what you're talking about gets very political, and trying to understand the practical politics of that. When you've essentially got a series of regimes now that could honestly be described as enemies of the planet, and they are proliferating. So, I mean, is partly what you're talking about in Extinction Rebellion and so forth, is that the right response to that? I'm not entirely sure.
Well, look, in terms of Extinction Rebellion, in terms of this leaflet and so on, it's a kind of experiment. I'm quite impressed with it so far. It's early days. I think that something like what the Extinction Rebellion are both talking about and trying to do, I mean, in terms of their objectives and in terms of the methods for trying to achieve it, are on the right track if we're going to have any chance of achieving the 1.5 degree ambition. You know, that requires total civilizational transformation very rapidly, going up against huge vested interests, not only going through conventional political and democratic processes. So that's what I would say about that. In terms of your points about sort of the politics of lifeboats and so on, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are very awkward and difficult questions to think about here. I've touched on one of them by talking about, does it really make sense to carry on talking about freedom of movement? We should be willing to take some climate refugees potentially in this country, it seems to me. After all, we're the cause of a lot of the trouble. We had the Industrial Revolution first. But we literally don't have much capacity to take very many if it starts to get to the point that I'm afraid it is likely to get to. And at the end of the day, it seems to me there ought to be lifeboats. It would be better for some civilization to survive than for no civilization to survive. But what you need to do, and this is why I'm talking about the importance of thinking civilizational succession, what you need to do is to try to ensure that any way in which you go about creating such lifeboats isn't so repellent and aggressive and immoral and so on as to be kind of self-undermining or better that it hadn't happened at all. And that's a real challenge. Coming back to your first point about how this is simultaneously kind of climate realism and feels, it's very hard for it to feel kind of fully real to us, you know, comfortably in this hall and with our lifestyles, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And on that front, one of the things that we badly need is really good art that starts to make it real. Now, I'm happy to be able to announce to anyone in the room who doesn't know that you are someone who's been making some of that art. This is Steve Waters, the playwright, who's done some very interesting stuff around climate change through drama. We need a lot more of that. We need it to look unabashedly at what's likely to happen. We need it across all media, including mass media. That means we very badly need it in film and television, where we've had virtually none of it to date. You know, there are examples that I've worked on myself, which are can kind of be talked about here. There's The Road, but of course The Road, you know, doesn't offer much by way of a successor civilization. There's Avatar, which is, I think, immensely inspiring, but deliberately, I think, completely unrealistic. If we're trying to think about kind of realistic ways in which we can imagine what's likely to be coming, I think that so far the arts have not done well on this front, and in particular television has almost completely failed. I think that's probably a lot for political reasons, as well as a sort of lack of imagination, perhaps. So yeah, we need to find ways of being able to do things that we're not very good at doing as humans, especially in this culture, thinking long term, imagining profound change. Tolstoy says somewhere, or is it Machiavelli? Machiavelli says somewhere that human beings can never really understand anything until they've experienced it. Well, if that's true, then we're in a hell of a lot of trouble, and there seems to be a fair amount of truth to it, because we have to anticipate this ahead of time, partly because of one of the awful aspects of the challenge of dangerous climate change is the time lags that are systematically built into it. You know, if we were going to tackle this, if we were going to actually get a grip on it, we would have done so a generation ago. You know, roughly speaking, we would have elected green governments everywhere in the world a generation ago, and they would have done things that were quite unpalatable to a lot of us. And we didn't, right? So now we're in a kind of real last chance saloon, arguably quite a lot more last chancey than the 1.5 degree IPCC report lets on. And we have to find ways of making that real to ourselves. Again, somebody who can help here is Joanna Macy. Some of the exercises in the work that reconnects are very much about projecting yourself into the future, which can be very powerful.
Thank you. That was a great question. Anyone else? Any questions? Yeah, there's another one there.
So I just had a quick question about if we were going to make the transformation.
Yeah.
So that seems like the best possible solution.
Yeah.
And I was just kind of wondering what sort of radical changes could we possibly make that might allow that to happen, such as I've heard about really widespread rewilding or radically cutting population growth rates. I just wanted to hear your opinion.
Yeah, good. So I haven't said much about that, partly because lots of other people have said lots about that. So I'll briefly say a bit more, and then I'll say a little bit more about why I haven't said more about it. Yeah, the examples you gave are good. I think it's very clear that we need to find humane ways of reducing the human population. Of course, it's true that the populations in the richer countries are the ones which it's far more important to reduce. So traditionally, advocates of population reduction have focused on countries like Africa and India. That's actually kind of the wrong end of the telescope. The most important countries to reduce populations in are countries like this one, and the United States, and Australia, and Kuwait, which is, by the way, another reason for thinking that freedom of movement, if that means increased immigration to those countries, is not very sensible from an ecological perspective. But the larger the human population is, the more reckless, essentially, we're being, the more we're embarking into a terra incognita, which we know is likely to be dangerous. I think that systematic rewilding, done cleverly with an eye to kind of mitigation and sequestration, is absolutely clearly part of what we need to do. We need to restore genuine biodiverse ecosystems and oppose the culture of monoculture, which is one of the reasons why the geoengineering solutions, which are most popular, are potentially catastrophic. There would be a sort of massive expansion of the drive towards biofuels and palm oil and so on that we've already seen. We need to have massive institutional change. So, as Cornelia said at the start, I've been writing a lot about the precautionary principle. We should really adopt the precautionary principle. We should adopt it around the world. We should act on it really, really seriously. That would be transformational, I think. And I've also argued, and actually you can see some of this on some of the publications on the table in the when we have the drinks afterwards. I've also argued that we need to change our democratic systems to build in long-termism into them, and to build in care for future generations into them. And I mentioned earlier also another important thing, which is a massive reduction in the amount of animal flesh that we consume. In particular, basically, we need to abolish factory farming of animals, and actually, we need to abolish factory farming in total. The real underlying problem is not animal agriculture, it's industrial agriculture. And industrial agriculture includes animal agriculture as its most cruel and horrible and destructive element. But if you just switch from eating beef raised on soy to eating the soybeans directly, you're still not doing much for the planet if the soybeans you're eating directly were grown where there was previously Amazon rainforest. So these are some of the big things that we need to do. I really hope we do them. Let's try and do them. We should be doing them right now, and some of them we are, and some people in this room probably are involved in some of these things. But now a brief word about why I didn't say more about these things. It's not just that everyone else has been saying loads about them, or lots of other people. It's also that I think that the way that people have focused on these things so much has not enabled us to look clearly in the face enough what is coming. I think if we spend all our time talking about these radical transformational solutions, especially when we realize that, yeah, absolutely, let's try and make them happen. And the wonderful thing about human beings is that our agency and our powers are never known to us before we've tried, There can be extraordinary tipping points in human culture and human thinking and so on, which are completely unpredictable before. And that's why it's premature. Anybody who says we are doomed, we are all going to go extinct or something, no, that's not it. There are definitely going to be more animal extinctions, and there is a possibility of human extinction. But the idea of the Extinction Rebellion is to stop as many extinctions as we possibly can. And we don't know yet what the limits are to how successful we can be at that. But if we spend all our time thinking about these radical transformations, then we're not spending any of our time actually looking in the face the likelihood that we're going to fail. Or at least we're not spending any of our time preparing for the possibility of failure. Let me put it even no more strongly than that. We have to prepare for the possibility of failure. It is absolutely unacceptable that, for example, in the name of stopping dangerous climate change, we're building nuclear power stations, which are going to be the most terrible liabilities for future generations if civilization does collapse. If you have the cooling pools at nuclear power stations, like with the rods in them, you have to keep them cool for decades, right? And if you don't, they will very quickly, the pools will dry out, the rods will catch fire, and they will burn radioactive fire, potentially for hundreds of years. I mean, just think about that as a legacy that we and the French and so on may be leaving to the future, to whatever animals or successor civilization comes after us. It's radically unacceptable. So we have to think about these things as well. It's not enough to think about the transformations we want to make.
Thank you. Yeah. So we've got one question there, and then we'll come to you in the check chat afterwards.
Thank you. I agreed entirely with what you said about the Green Party as the crucial force talking about environmental concerns. But the currency of electoral politics is to offer solutions to the problems that we face and to at least present yourself as being in a position to bring about those solutions. So how, in the light of what you said, are Greens to fight elections?
Okay, that's a nice question. So I guess there's two things that I would say. Firstly, I would urge Greens to do a bit more of what I'm doing and coming a little bit cleaner. Now, this is very difficult for practicing politicians. It's not a very kind of attractive message to a mass public, the kind of thing that I've been saying here. And politicians are kind of expected, as you say, to provide solutions, to provide hope, etc. So I know for a fact, for example, that Caroline Lucas is haunted by some of these fears. But I also understand that she finds it difficult to find a context in which it's easy for her in public to be absolutely direct with people about just how worried, terrified, whatever she is. But I think we can go further than we've gone. I think I think that we need to widen the the Overton window. We need to make it possible to start to talk about some of these things. For example, to talk about why most geoengineering schemes are profoundly reckless and unacceptable in this context. Why this is a whole new argument against nuclear power, and so on and so forth. And the second thing I would say is that I think that Greens need to be ready for the possibility of some kind of electoral political revolution. So do I think it's likely to happen? Again, no. Do I think it could happen? Yes. And the human power to make these kind of things happen, we have seen it before. A fascinating example is in Latvia a few years ago. The Peasants and Greens Party, they had one seat, they went into an election. They fought the election on an anti-immigration platform, because they're suffering huge brain drain to countries like ours. This was hugely successful, and they went from one seat to being the largest party in Parliament in one election. Remember when the Labour Party was founded, people in the early days said, well, you're never going to get anywhere, everyone should just vote Liberal, it's never going to change. But it did, even under first past the post. Greens should be ready for the possibility, I'm not saying it's likely, but I'm saying it's possible, Greens should be ready for the possibility that there will be a huge consciousness shift, possibly prompted by coming climate disasters, which will suddenly make the green prospects much more credible in this country. So that's something to hope for.
We had a question with the man in the check shirt, so we could just go to him first.
Hi, that's very loud. I was very interested by what you said about the kind of psychological element of the whole issue. I think that's maybe at the heart of individual decisions about whether to engage or not in environmental politics on a personal level. And I think, in particular, one thing that a lot of people find difficult about the kind of perceptions of the environmental movement is a kind of purist, quite kind of morally pure like views of how to engage in it, and the accusation of hypocrisy is, I think, quite a common one. You know, you've woken up to the environmental realities, yet you still go to these shops, you still eat this food. You know, so I think what do you say to someone who accuses you of being a hypocrite?
Yeah. So the first thing to say to such a person is, well, do you do this right thing that you're saying everyone should do, or you're saying I'm saying everyone should do? And the answer, of course, is almost always no. So then I say, well, then you're in no position to lecture me about it, right? If you want to lecture me about not flying or something, then first don't fly, right? The second thing I say to such people is, actually, it's really important to be clear here that what we do politically, what we do collectively, is more important than what we do individually. Right? We've been taught otherwise because we've been taught in a liberal individualistic way, which works well for the norms of this culture, works well for corporations, etc. Right? No, what really matters is what we decide to do politically. So, for example, if I am trying to create a future in which there's a lot less flying, then it's far more important that I spend a lot of time and energy doing that and, for example, give large amounts of money to it or whatever it is, than that I make my own decisions either way on whether it should fly or not. You know, that makes very, very little difference what I do, whether I fly or not. But I could make a huge difference if I, for example, get a law changed, right? But the third point to make is, and this is the point where what these people say has some validity to it, is that we should try as much as we can to practice what we preach as soon as we can and to show leadership. And in particular, I think that in this country, we really need to show leadership. You know, if we're going to be serious in saying to so-called developing countries, look, don't go down the route that we've gone down. It results in huge amounts of mental ill health and blah, blah, blah. And most importantly of all, it is destroying our common future. That has no credibility unless we can actually show them that we are serious about pursuing a different path. And that works on the national level, but it also works on the individual level as well. So I think that it's much more important that I, for example, give large amounts of money to the Green Party as I do, than whether or not I fly. But I actually fly very, very little. And I think that's important too, that I try, for example, to do as much as I can, including in my job via video conferencing. Where that's not possible, I try to go by train. So I've gone on 2 huge train journeys giving talks around Europe this year, rather than flying. And I think in that way, we model what is possible. We show some leadership. We try to show some congruence. It's not the most important thing, but you should do it anyway.
We had one question there, and I'm really sorry, but if you can ask your question in the drinks reception. So we'll take your question, and then that will be the end of the talk. Thank you.
This gent here, I think.
Yeah.
You pass it along, maybe. I'll just shout. All right, if you can.
Given that what we're dealing with is global, and that's produced by the globalization of the Industrial Revolution, as incidentally mentioned, that we launched, aren't the most interested parties those not the individual workers and voters, but the people who meet at Davos and endurance. And it's in their interest too to survive.
Yeah.
Isn't that the pressure point?
Well, I don't think it's the pressure point, but I think you're absolutely right. It's a pressure point. It's a very important pressure point. So I have one or two colleagues who are trying to work in this area and trying to reach those extremely rich people and influencing them. There are one or two difficulties. One quite important difficulty is that some of these people, I think, fantasize that they can survive a civilizational collapse. And that's why, for example, some of the super rich are buying up property in New Zealand. And they're probably right in the short to medium term. You know, they may be able to buy themselves an extra 10 years, 15 years, something like that. And, you know, maybe if they're 50 years old or something, that's all they care about. If that's all they care about, they are incredibly, horrendously selfish. They should care, for example, at the very least, about their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. And there is no way you can safeguard their future by buying up some fancy property in New Zealand, right? If you actually want to take care of your own descendants, let alone everybody else in the world and all the other animals, if you actually want to take care of your own descendants, the only way you can do it is by saving the collective future. In that sense, we really are all in this together. And that seems to me a very powerful argument, which is a key argument that I'm now trying to make, and I will do my best to get some of those people to read it, although I'm not incredibly well connected in those circles. If anyone in the room is, maybe you could give me your address book. So yeah, I think it's a really good and important question, but I don't think it should preoccupy us to the exclusion of everything else. What we do as well, in the broad or narrow senses of we, is of importance.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So please do make your way through to the main concourse and have a glass of wine and come and pick up some of the materials that Rupert has brought with him and ask more questions as well. And then before we go, will you please all just join me in raising a final hand for Dr. Rupert Read?
And thank you.